Behind the golden gates of Buckingham Palace, where every whisper carries the weight of a kingdom and every secret could topple a throne, young Prince William stumbled upon a truth that would shake the very foundations of the British crown. In the sterile corridors of the Royal Medical Wing, where even the air seemed heavy with unspoken fears, a confrontation was brewing that would expose the desperate lengths to which the palace would go to protect King Charles's most guarded secret. What William witnessed that fateful Tuesday morning would haunt him for years to come. As his stepmother Camila stood before an imposing guard, her hands trembling with a mixture of rage and desperation, demanding access to medical records that could either save or destroy the monarchy, William realized that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not on distant shores, but within the walls of one's own home. The truth about the king's condition was more terrifying than any enemy the realm had ever faced. And as William watched from the shadows, he understood that in the world of royalty, knowledge isn't just power. It's a weapon that could either heal a dying king or bury a kingdom in scandal forever. The morning sun cast long shadows through the ornate windows of Kensington Palace as Prince William made his way through the familiar corridors toward his father's private medical wing. The usual bustle of palace life seemed muted today, replaced by an unsettling quiet that made every footstep echo against the marble floors. William had been summoned for what his father's private secretary had described as an urgent family consultation, though the vague nature of the request had left him with more questions than answers. As he approached the secured entrance to the medical facility, William noticed something unusual. The typically minimal security had been dramatically increased, with additional guards positioned at every access point. Their faces were stern, almost grave, and they scrutinized even his royal credentials with an intensity that seemed excessive for a routine family visit. The medical wing of the palace had always been a place of discretion and privacy, but today it felt more like a fortress. The sterile white walls seemed to close in around him as he walked deeper into the facility, guided by a nervous-looking aide who kept glancing over her shoulder as if expecting to be followed. The air carried the sharp scent of disinfectant mixed with something else. Fear, perhaps, or the weight of secrets too heavy to bear. William had grown accustomed to the unusual aspects of royal life, but something about today felt different. His father, King Charles, had been increasingly absent from public engagements over the past few weeks, citing what the palace had termed routine health monitoring. The official statements had been reassuring, almost mundane in their banality. But William had noticed the worried glances exchanged between senior staff members and the hushed conversations that stopped whenever he entered a room. As he waited in an elegantly appointed consultation room, William's mind wandered to the recent changes in his father's appearance. The king had grown noticeably thinner, his usually vibrant complexion had taken on a pallor that makeup could barely conceal, and there was a weariness in his eyes that seemed to go beyond mere fatigue. Yet whenever William had expressed concern, his father had dismissed his worries with a wave of his hand and a joke about the burdens of wearing a heavy crown. The door to the consultation room opened, and Dr. Harrison Whitmore, the king's personal physician for over 2 decades, entered with a file clutched tightly in his hands. His usually composed demeanor showed cracks of strain, and William noticed the slight tremor in the doctor's hands as he set the file on the polished mahogany table between them. "Your Royal Highness, Dr. Bishop," Whitmore began, his voice carrying a gravity that immediately set William on edge. "Thank you for coming so quickly. I'm afraid we have a situation that requires your immediate attention and absolute discretion." William straightened in his chair, his training in royal protocol warring with his instincts as a son and future king. "Doctor, please speak plainly. What's wrong with my father?" "Doctor..." Whitmore opened the file, revealing a collection of medical reports, test results, and imaging scans that meant little to William but clearly carried enormous weight for the physician. "His Majesty has been undergoing a series of comprehensive medical evaluations over the past month. What we've discovered is concerning." The word hung in the air like a death sentence, and William felt his stomach tighten with dread. Concerning how? The initial symptoms appeared minor: fatigue, occasional discomfort, nothing that seemed immediately alarming given His Majesty's age and the stresses of his position. However, further investigation has revealed abnormalities that require immediate and ongoing treatment. William's hands gripped the arms of his chair as he struggled to maintain his composure. "Are you telling me my father is seriously ill?" Dr. Whitmore hesitated, clearly weighing his words carefully. "His Majesty is facing a significant health challenge that will require extensive treatment and may necessitate adjustments to his royal duties. The exact nature of the condition must remain strictly confidential for now. But I can tell you that we've assembled a team of the world's leading specialists. Before William could respond, the sound of raised voices echoed from the corridor outside. Both men turned toward the door as the commotion grew louder, punctuated by the firm voice of a security guard and what sounded like an increasingly frustrated woman demanding access. "I am the Queen Consort," Camila's voice rang out clearly through the heavy wooden door. "I have every right to see those files, and I will not be denied access to information about my husband's condition." William and Dr. Whitmore exchanged glances, both recognizing the precarious situation developing just outside their door. The doctor quickly closed the file and stood, his professional composure reasserting itself despite the obvious stress of the moment. "Your Royal Highness, Doctor," Whitmore said quietly, "I must ask that you remain here while I address this situation. The information we've discussed today is of the utmost sensitivity." William nodded, though every instinct told him to investigate the confrontation in the hallway. "As Doctor." Whitmore exited the room, closing the door firmly behind him. William found himself alone with the weight of partial knowledge and growing dread about what he had not yet been told. The voices in the corridor continued, though they were now too muffled to make out individual words. William stood and moved closer to the door, torn between respecting the privacy of what was clearly a sensitive medical discussion and his growing concern for both his father and stepmother. Minutes passed like hours as William waited, his mind racing through the implications of what little he had learned. If his father was facing a serious illness, the ramifications would extend far beyond their family. The stability of the monarchy itself could be at stake, and the delicate balance of public confidence that the crown depended upon could be shattered by the wrong information released at the wrong time. The door finally reopened, and Dr. Whitmore returned, his face grave and his usual professional calm clearly strained. "I apologize for the interruption, Your Royal Highness. We have some additional matters to discuss regarding your father's care and the protocols we must follow." William studied the doctor's face, noting the beads of perspiration on his forehead despite the cool temperature of the room. "What exactly happened out there, Doctor? And what aren't you telling me about my father's condition?" "Doctor." Whitmore sat heavily in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 63 years. "Your Royal Highness, what I'm about to share with you will require the strongest discretion. The future of the monarchy may depend on how carefully we handle this information." William felt his heart rate increase as he prepared to hear words that would change everything he thought he knew about his father's health and the future of the crown. Outside the consultation room, the palace continued its daily operations, but inside this small, sterile space, the fate of a kingdom hung in the balance. The afternoon light streaming through the windows had begun to fade, casting the room in shadows that seemed to mirror the darkness of the revelations yet to come. William braced himself for the truth, knowing that once he heard it, there would be no returning to the relative innocence of the morning. "Doctor." Whitmore opened the file once again, his hand steadier now, but his voice carrying the weight of terrible knowledge. "Your father, His Majesty King Charles, has been diagnosed with a condition that will fundamentally alter not only his life, but the future of the British crown itself." As the doctor began to speak, William realized that this moment would be remembered as the turning point when everything changed, when the carefully constructed facade of royal invincibility cracked to reveal the very human vulnerability beneath the crown. The confrontation in the hallway had been just the beginning. What William was about to learn would test every aspect of his character, his loyalty to his family, and his understanding of what it truly meant to serve the crown. The weight of secrets was about to become his burden to bear, and the choices he made in the coming days would echo through history. In the growing twilight of that fateful day, as shadows lengthened across the palace grounds and the business of the kingdom continued around them, a son prepared to hear the words that would forever change his understanding of his father, his family, and the institution they served. The crown, it seemed, was far heavier than gold and jewels could account for. The words that Dr. Whitmore spoke next would haunt William for months to come. King Charles had been diagnosed with a rare and aggressive form of cancer that had already begun spreading throughout his system. The prognosis was uncertain at best, and the treatment would require a level of secrecy and coordination that would challenge every protocol the palace had ever established. The tumor was discovered during routine screening, Dr. Whitmore explained, his voice barely above a whisper. What appeared to be minor symptoms were actually early indicators of a much more serious condition. We've consulted with specialists from around the world, and while there are treatment options available, they will require His Majesty to undergo extensive chemotherapy and possibly surgical intervention. William felt the room spin around him as the implications crashed down like waves against a crumbling seawall. His father, the King of England, the symbol of stability and continuity that the nation depended upon, was facing a battle for his very life. The crown that had seemed so permanent, so enduring, suddenly felt as fragile as spun glass. "How long have you known?" William managed to ask, his voice hoarse with emotion he was struggling to contain.
"The definitive diagnosis came through 3 days ago," Dr. Whitmore replied.
"His Majesty insisted that you be informed immediately, but he also insisted that the information be contained within the smallest possible circle until we could develop a comprehensive plan for managing both his treatment and the public response." The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside reminded William of the confrontation he had witnessed earlier. "What about Camila? What was happening out there, Doctor?" Whitmore's expression grew even more troubled. "Her Majesty the Queen Consort has been demanding access to His Majesty's complete medical records. She's been excluded from certain aspects of the treatment planning at His Majesty's specific request, and she's become increasingly frustrated with what she perceives as a lack of transparency." William stood and began pacing the small room, his mind racing through the complex web of relationships, protocols, and potential consequences that surrounded this revelation.
"Why would my father exclude his own wife from his medical decisions? That's not for me to say, Your Royal Highness," Dr. Whitmore replied diplomatically.
"However, I can tell you that His Majesty has been very specific about who should have access to what information and when. He's expressed particular concern about premature leaks to the media or unauthorized disclosures that could destabilize the monarchy during this critical period." The implications of his father's condition began to crystallize in William's mind. If the king was unable to fulfill his duties, the entire structure of constitutional monarchy would need to adapt. Parliament would need to be informed, the Commonwealth would require reassurance, and the delicate balance of public confidence that kept the institution relevant in modern Britain could be shattered if the news was mishandled. "What's the timeline for his treatment?" William asked, forcing himself to focus on practical matters rather than the emotional weight of the situation. "Treatment will begin within the week, Dr. Brooker," Whitmore explained. "Initially, we'll be able to conduct most of the therapy discreetly within the palace medical facilities. However, as the treatment intensifies, His Majesty may need to spend extended periods away from public view. We're developing cover stories for reduced public engagement, but eventually, some form of public announcement will become necessary." William nodded, understanding the delicate balance between transparency and stability that would need to be maintained. "Who else knows about this?" "Currently, the circle includes myself, 2 other specialists who've been brought in under strict confidentiality agreements, His Majesty's private secretary, and now yourself. The Prime Minister will need to be briefed within 48 hours, and arrangements will need to be made for potential regency protocols should His Majesty's condition deteriorate significantly." The word regency sent a chill through William's spine. The idea that he might need to assume his father's duties while the king fought for his life was both terrifying and sobering. He had trained for this role his entire life, but he had always assumed it would come through natural transition, not through crisis and uncertainty. "What about Harry?" William asked, referring to his younger brother. "When will he be told?" Whitmore hesitated. "His Majesty has been very specific about the timing of various disclosures. He wishes to speak with Prince Harry personally, but he's concerned about the potential for information to leak given the current complications in that relationship." William understood the delicate reference to his brother's strained relationship with the royal family following his decision to step back from official duties and move to America. The family tensions that had played out so publicly in recent years now took on a new urgency as they faced this crisis together. A sharp knock on the door interrupted their conversation, followed by the voice of a palace aide. "Doctor Whitmore, His Majesty is requesting your immediate presence in his private chambers. He says it's urgent." The doctor gathered his files quickly, clearly relieved to have a reason to escape the intensity of the conversation. "Your Royal Highness, I must ask that you maintain absolute confidentiality about what we've discussed today. Any unauthorized disclosure could have catastrophic consequences not just for His Majesty's treatment, but for the stability of the crown itself." William nodded gravely, understanding the weight of the secret he now carried. As Dr. Whitmore hurried from the room, William found himself alone with knowledge that felt too enormous and terrible to contain. His father was dying, and the entire future of the monarchy hung in the balance. He moved to the window and looked out over the palace grounds, where gardeners continued their work and security personnel maintained their posts, all unaware that the very foundation of their world was cracking beneath their feet. The normalcy of the scene felt surreal given the magnitude of what he had just learned. His phone buzzed with a text message from Catherine, asking about dinner plans for the evening. The mundane nature of the message struck him as both comforting and jarring.
Life outside this room continued as if nothing had changed, while inside his world had been fundamentally altered. William realized that he would need to master the art of living with terrible knowledge while maintaining the facade of normalcy. Every public appearance, every family interaction, every decision would now be colored by the awareness of his father's condition and the uncertainty it brought to their future. As he prepared to leave the medical wing and return to his regular duties, William caught sight of Camila in the corridor ahead. She was speaking animatedly with a man in a dark suit whom William recognized as one of the palace's senior legal advisors. Her body language suggested frustration and determination, and William found himself wondering what exactly she hoped to accomplish with her demands for access to his father's medical information. The dynamic between Camila and the rest of the royal family had always been complex, shaped by history, public perception, and the delicate process of integrating her into an institution that had initially resisted her presence.
Now, with Charles's illness threatening to upend everything, those tensions seem to be reaching a breaking point.
William decided to approach them, hoping to better understand what was driving Camila's actions and perhaps find a way to ease the growing conflict within the family, at a time when unity would be crucial for navigating the challenges ahead. "Camila," he called out as he approached, noting how both she and the legal advisor seemed to tense at his appearance. "William," she replied, her voice carrying a mixture of relief and wariness, "I'm glad you're here. Perhaps you can help me understand why I'm being excluded from decisions about my own husband's medical care." The legal advisor stepped forward slightly, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Your Royal Highness," he addressed William, "perhaps this discussion would be better held in a more private setting." William looked between Camila and the advisor, recognizing that he was being drawn into a conflict that could have serious implications for his family and the monarchy. The knowledge he now carried about his father's condition weighed heavily as he tried to navigate between loyalty to his father's wishes and the need to maintain family unity during an incredibly difficult time. "I think we all need to sit down and discuss this properly," William said diplomatically. "But first I need to speak with my father." As he walked away from the confrontation, William realized that the medical diagnosis was only the beginning of the challenges they would face. The human dynamics within the royal family, complicated by decades of history and recent tensions, would prove just as difficult to navigate as the medical crisis itself. The palace around him continued its ancient rhythms, but William now understood that they were living through a moment that would define the monarchy for generations to come. The crown that had seemed so permanent was revealed to be as fragile and human as those who wore it. William found his father in his private study, a room that had always been Charles's sanctuary within the overwhelming grandeur of the palace. The king was seated behind his antique desk, looking smaller and more fragile than William had ever seen him. The afternoon light filtering through the heavy curtains cast shadows that seemed to emphasize the new hollowness in his father's cheeks and the weariness that had settled into his eyes. "Father," William said softly as he entered, noting how Charles's hand trembled slightly as he set down his pen. "William," Charles replied, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Doctor, Whitmore tells me he's brought you up to speed on my situation." The euphemistic language felt strange given the gravity of what they were discussing, but William understood his father's need to maintain some semblance of control over how the crisis was framed and discussed. He explained the diagnosis and the treatment plan. "Father, I'm so sorry. How are you feeling about all of this?" Charles leaned back in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 75 years. "Honestly, terrified. Not of dying necessarily, though that's certainly a concern, but terrified of what this means for the monarchy, for the country, for everything we've worked to build and maintain." William moved closer to his father's desk, noticing the stacks of documents that suggested Charles had been working despite his illness. "You don't have to carry this burden alone. Here, I'm here, and we'll figure this out together." "That's just it, William," Charles said, his voice carrying a weariness that went beyond physical fatigue. "This isn't something we can simply figure out together. Every decision we make from this point forward will have consequences that ripple through the entire constitutional structure of the country. If I'm unable to fulfill my duties, if the public loses confidence in the stability of the crown," the sentence hung unfinished, but William understood the implications. The British monarchy existed at the pleasure of the people, maintained through a delicate balance of tradition, relevance, and public confidence. A crisis of leadership, especially one involving serious illness, could provide ammunition for Republicans and critics who had long argued for the abolition of the monarchical system. "What about Camila?" William asked, broaching the subject he knew would be difficult.
She's clearly upset about being excluded from your medical decisions. Charles's expression darkened, and he turned to gaze out the window at the palace gardens. Camila means well, but she doesn't understand the broader implications of what we're dealing with. She wants to be involved, to support me through this, and I appreciate that. But she also has a tendency to speak first and consider consequences later. William remembered the confrontation he had witnessed earlier and began to understand his father's concerns. You're worried she might inadvertently reveal information before we're ready to handle the public response.
It's not just that, Charles replied, rebellious.
Camila has her own relationship with the media, her own way of handling pressure. During my previous marriage, private medical information became public in ways that were damaging to everyone involved.
I can't risk that happening again, not when the stakes are this high. The reference to his previous marriage to William's mother, Diana, brought back memories of the intense media scrutiny and public drama that had surrounded the royal family during those difficult years. William understood his father's caution, but he also recognized the impossible position it put Camila in as Charles's current wife and the Queen Consort. She has a right to be involved in decisions about your care, William said carefully. And excluding her completely might create more problems than including her would. Charles nodded slowly. You're probably right, but I need to know that any information shared will be contained within our immediate family. The moment this news leaks to the press before we're ready to control the narrative, everything becomes infinitely more complicated. A soft knock on the study door interrupted their conversation. Charles's private secretary, Margaret Thornton, entered with a concerned expression.
Your Majesty, I apologize for the interruption, but we have a situation that requires your immediate attention.
What kind of situation? Charles asked, though his tone suggested he was already dreading the answer. Her Majesty the Queen Consort has contacted several members of the medical team directly, requesting copies of your test results and treatment plans. She's also been in communication with Lord Pemberton about potential legal avenues for accessing the information she's been denied. William felt his stomach drop as he realized the implications of what Margaret was describing. Lord Pemberton was one of the country's most prominent constitutional lawyers, someone who would understand exactly how to navigate the complex legal landscape surrounding royal medical privacy and spousal rights. Charles closed his eyes and rubbed his temples, clearly struggling with both the physical effects of his illness and the mounting pressure of the family crisis it had created.
Has she made any direct threats about going public with her concerns?
Not directly, Your Majesty, Margaret replied carefully. However, she has expressed frustration about being treated like an outsider in her own family.
She's also mentioned that she has a duty to the people to ensure that Your Majesty is receiving appropriate care. The phrase duty to the people sent alarm bells ringing for both William and Charles. In the context of royal protocol and public relations, such language suggested that Camila might be considering some form of public statement or action that could force the palace's hand regarding disclosure of the king's condition. We need to speak with her immediately, William said, recognizing that the situation was rapidly escalating beyond their ability to control it quietly. Charles nodded, though he looked exhausted at the prospect of another difficult conversation. Margaret, please ask Her Majesty to join us here in 15 minutes. And please ensure that our discussion remains completely private. As Margaret left to arrange the meeting, father and son sat in silence for a moment, both contemplating the growing complexity of their situation. What had begun as a medical crisis was rapidly becoming a constitutional and family emergency that threatened to spiral beyond their control. William, Charles said finally, I need you to understand something. If this information becomes public before we're ready, if the media gets hold of it and begins speculating about my ability to serve, the damage to the monarchy could be irreversible. The vultures are always circling, waiting for any sign of weakness they can exploit. William understood his father's concerns, but he also recognized that their current approach was creating its own set of problems. Father, with respect, trying to control this completely might be impossible. Perhaps we should consider being more proactive about managing the disclosure rather than trying to prevent it entirely? You mean announce it ourselves on our own terms? Charles asked. Exactly. If we wait too long, if this information leaks in pieces or comes out during a moment of crisis, we'll lose all control over how it's perceived and what it means for the future of the crown. Charles considered this, clearly torn between his instinct for privacy and his recognition of the political realities they faced. The timing would be crucial.
We'd need to ensure that the announcement comes with a clear plan for continuity, reassurance about the stability of the institution, and confidence in the treatment prognosis.
We could work with the communications team to develop a comprehensive strategy, William suggested.
something that acknowledges the seriousness of the situation while emphasizing your commitment to your duties and the strength of the institutional structures that support the monarchy. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside signaled Camila's arrival for what promised to be one of the most difficult conversations of their family's recent history.
Both men braced themselves for a confrontation that would test not only their family bonds, but also their ability to present a united front during the most challenging period the monarchy had faced in decades. "Whatever happens in the next few minutes," Charles said quietly, "we must remember that we're not just a family dealing with illness.
We're the custodians of an institution that represents stability and continuity for millions of people. Our personal feelings and conflicts must not be allowed to undermine that responsibility."
William nodded, understanding the weight of duty that shaped every aspect of their lives, even in moments of personal crisis. The crown, it seemed, was both their greatest privilege and their heaviest burden. As Camila's voice could be heard in the outer office growing closer to the study, William realized that the next few minutes would determine not only how they handled his father's illness, but also how the royal family would navigate the complex intersection of personal relationships and public responsibility that defined their existence. The monarchy had survived wars, scandals, and constitutional crises throughout its long history, but it had always done so by adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining its essential character. Now, facing perhaps the greatest test of William's lifetime, they would need to find a way to honor both their duty to the crown and their obligations to each other, as a family struggling with an impossible situation. Camila entered the study with the bearing of a woman who had reached the limits of her patience. Her usual composed demeanor showed cracks of frustration and determination that immediately shifted the atmosphere in the room. She glanced between Charles and William, clearly aware that she was walking into a conversation that had been taking place without her.
"I suppose you've both been discussing my unreasonable demands for transparency about my own husband's medical condition," she said, her voice carrying an edge that William had rarely heard from his stepmother. Charles gestured to a chair near his desk. "Please, sit down. We need to discuss this properly, and I owe you an explanation for the decisions I've made."
Camila remained standing, her posture rigid with barely contained emotion. "Charles, I've been your wife for nearly 2 decades.
I've stood by your side through every scandal, every crisis, every moment when the press and the public questioned my right to be here. And now, when you're facing the most serious challenge of your life, you're treating me like a stranger who can't be trusted with basic information about your health." The pain in her voice was unmistakable, and William felt a stab of sympathy for the impossible position she found herself in. The royal family's instinct for secrecy and control had created a situation where even those closest to them could become inadvertent enemies. "It's not about trust, Camila," Charles said gently. "It's about protecting both you and the institution from the consequences of premature disclosure. Once this information becomes public, everything changes. The media attention will be overwhelming, the speculation will be endless, and every aspect of our lives will be scrutinized in ways that could be damaging to everyone involved." Camila finally took the offered seat, but her posture remained tense. "So your solution is to exclude me from decisions about your treatment? To have me learn about my husband's condition secondhand from palace staff who look at me with pity?" William intervened, recognizing that the conversation was heading toward territory that could damage family relationships beyond repair. "Camila, I understand your frustration, but perhaps we can find a way to include you in the process while still maintaining the security we need around this information." "What kind of security are we talking about?" Camila asked, turning her attention to William. "Are we planning to hide Charles's illness indefinitely? Because that's not just unrealistic, it's potentially dangerous. If his condition deteriorates and the public finds out we've been concealing it, the backlash could destroy the monarchy more effectively than any honest disclosure would." Her words struck at the heart of the dilemma they all faced. The very secrecy they were using to protect the institution could ultimately prove to be its undoing if it was perceived as deception or manipulation of the public trust. Charles leaned forward, his illness making the gesture seem more labored than it once would have. "You're right about the risks of concealment. William and I were just discussing the possibility of a proactive announcement, something that would allow us to control the narrative rather than react to leaks or speculation." "Then why wasn't I included in that discussion?" Camila asked, her frustration evident. "I'm not just the king's wife, I'm the queen consort. I have constitutional responsibilities and public duties that will be directly affected by how we handle this crisis." William recognized the validity of her argument and the dangerous precedent they were setting by excluding her from critical decisions. "She's right, Father. We need her perspective, and we need to present a united front to the public."
Charles was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing the competing demands of secrecy, family unity, and institutional stability.
Very well. But if we're going to do this together, we need absolute agreement on how information is shared and with whom. Any deviation from our agreed approach could have catastrophic consequences.
Camila nodded, though her expression suggested she was still processing the magnitude of what she was being asked to take on.
What exactly are we dealing with? I know you're ill, but I need to understand the full scope of what we're facing.
Charles exchanged glances with William, then proceeded to share the details of his diagnosis, prognosis, and treatment plan. As he spoke, Camila's expression shifted from frustration to shock, then to a deep sadness that seemed to age her before their eyes.
How long do we have before this becomes impossible to hide? She asked when Charles had finished. Dr. Whitmore estimates we have perhaps 2 to 3 weeks before the effects of treatment become noticeable enough to raise questions, Charles replied. That gives us a narrow window to develop and implement a comprehensive communication strategy. What about the rest of the family? Camila asked.
Harry, Anne, Edward, Andrew, they'll all need to be informed, and they'll all need to be prepared for the public scrutiny that's coming. William felt the weight of the expanding circle of people who would need to be brought into their confidence.
Each additional person increased both the potential for leaks and the complexity of managing family dynamics during an already difficult time.
Harry will be the most challenging, William admitted.
His relationship with the family is still strained, and involving him in this crisis could create additional complications. He's your brother and Charles's son, Camila said firmly. Whatever difficulties exist between you, he has a right to know about his father's condition. And if this information comes out publicly before he's been told privately, the damage to family relationships could be permanent. Charles nodded slowly. You're both right. We'll need to reach out to Harry within the next day or two. The conversation won't be easy, but it's necessary. The discussion continued for another hour, with the three of them working through the complex logistics of managing a royal health crisis while maintaining family unity and public confidence. They discussed communication strategies, medical privacy protocols, and the delicate balance between transparency and institutional stability. As the afternoon wore on, William began to see a different side of Camila, one that went beyond the public perception of her as simply Charles's controversial second wife. Her questions were sharp and insightful, her understanding of constitutional implications was deeper than he had expected, and her commitment to protecting both her husband and the monarchy was genuine. There's one more thing we need to discuss, Camila said as their conversation began to wind down. The role I'll be expected to play if Charles's condition deteriorates and he's unable to fulfill his duties. The question hung in the air, touching on constitutional territory that none of them wanted to explore, but all of them knew they might have to navigate. If Charles became incapacitated, the machinery of regency would need to be activated, with William stepping into many of his father's roles, while Camila would face her own set of challenging responsibilities as the wife of an ailing monarch. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it, Charles said, though his tone suggested he was as troubled by the possibility as anyone. No, father, William said firmly. We need to plan for every contingency. If we're going to get through this crisis, we need to be prepared for the worst-case scenarios, not just the outcomes we hope for. The conversation that followed was perhaps the most difficult any of them had ever had, as they discussed the practical and emotional realities of what would happen if Charles's condition worsened. They talked about regency protocols, public responsibilities, and the challenge of maintaining institutional stability during a prolonged period of uncertainty. By the time they concluded their discussion, the sun had set over the palace grounds, and the weight of their shared burden had created a new understanding between them. They were no longer just a family dealing with illness. They were partners in navigating a crisis that would test every aspect of their characters and their commitment to the institution they served. As Camila prepared to leave the study, she turned back to Charles and William. Whatever happens in the coming weeks and months, we face it together. The monarchy has survived for over 1,000 years because it adapts to changing circumstances while maintaining its essential purpose. We'll find a way through this crisis, just as our predecessors found ways through theirs. William watched his father reach for Camila's hand, a gesture that spoke to the deep bond between them, despite the tensions that had surrounded their marriage. In that moment, he understood that the strength of the monarchy lay not just in its traditions and protocols, but in the very human relationships that sustained it through times of trial. The crisis was far from over. Charles's treatment would begin within days. The family conversations with Harry and the others would be difficult and unpredictable, and the challenge of managing public disclosure loomed over everything they did. But for the first time since learning of his father's diagnosis,
William felt that they had a chance to navigate the crisis successfully. The crown would endure, he realized, not because it was invulnerable to human frailty, but because those who wore it understood that true strength came from facing challenges together, with honesty, courage, and an unwavering commitment to something larger than themselves. As the palace settled into evening routines around them, three people who carried the weight of a kingdom on their shoulders prepared to face whatever trials lay ahead, united by circumstances that had tested them, but ultimately made them stronger. William presencia como un guardia impide a Camila acceder al historial médico secreto del rey Carlos. Drama real.